Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
Hi, Sasha.
We have a pretty remarkable thing to read to our listeners here today. This is a post from Reddit written by a young person who's thinking of detransitioning, and the parents are not happy about it. I'm just going to read to you what she wrote. I posted a few days ago here, and now I've talked to my parents about it. My mom kept comparing me to my older sister, who's super girly. She kept saying, "You're nothing like her, and she's obviously a girl." And she was saying this, but like we can be different and still be girls. She also said she didn't think I should go off blockers, as they are there to give me time, and going off of them would mean I get boobs and I go through female puberty. And she says that I've constantly said I'm a boy for 9 years, so it's wrong to go off of them now, which I guess makes sense. She also said she thinks it's because of all the transphobic stuff in the news, and she thinks I just don't want to be trans because of that. She kept asking if there was transphobia at school. My dad is kind of mad with me about it, and he accused me of attention seeking by being trans, which I wasn't, and then he said he'd lost friends because of it and blamed me for it, which was tough. I don't really know what to do, and I'm freaked out by this, and they don't even listen to me about this. I don't know what to do. I'm so confused about everything. My parents initially struggled with me being trans, but then they accepted it and became big trans allies and always call out transphobia and are quite protective of me being trans now. So I guess they feel like me doing this is like wasting all that energy for them. But to be honest, I don't know if they ever realized the problem. And more, I'm thinking that I'm just like a girl, but not a girly girl. And I think my mom keeps comparing me to my sister is bad for this, I guess.
Devastating. And the loneliness of this young person who is just trying to understand themselves in the way that we all do, and society gave them an answer. And at first the parents, God bless the parents, at first they resisted, saying, nah, that's not likely. But society told them it is likely. Clinicians presumably told them it is. And now I think it's and this is what we're talking about in this episode, it's the doubling down, it's the cognitive dissonance. The parents cannot entertain the idea that they might have hurt or maybe even further ruined, their child's certainly teenage years. It's such a horrifying thought. It would make my blood go cold. And so they're resisting it, saying, you've got it wrong. Because if you have it right, it's so horrifying to contemplate. I can't. That's effectively what the parents are thinking.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking to think about this kid trying to convince her parents that she is trans and having them resist and quote, finally coming around to becoming trans allies. Yeah. And now being so protective of her trans identity specifically. And they are in a really complicated and devastating situation. And so we wanted to use this post, which of course we don't know this individual, we don't know the family, we don't know who wrote this, but I think this is a good snapshot of something that is happening on multiple levels in the culture right now. At the most granular level between a child and her parents. And then this is also happening in schools and institutions. And of course, in the last couple of months, we've had a few kind of major pieces of development in the world of gender medicine for youth that presumably one might think this is going to be the beginning of the end. And we had the WPATH files come out that showed with, complete certainty that these physicians know there's no way to kind of get informed consent, that there are really serious consequences. And then, of course, we had the documents in the Alabama case discovery, which show that, there's an acknowledgement that there's no good evidence for these interventions. Cass report comes out, and you think, okay, this is the end. But shockingly, we have seen certain institutions, groups, and individuals just double down. And this Reddit post is a perfect example of how that happens on a micro level, and it's happening on a macro level too.
Wow, when you say all those events and how, we can hit people over the head with evidence. We have the research now. We can now say we have the research. Dr. Hilary Cass and her team for 4 years, they were absolutely neutral. They just collected the evidence and they came back and said, no, there's no evidence to support these interventions. It's just no quality evidence. And so now that's in. So the jury is in. It was out and now it's in. And yet people have just managed to dismiss it, to kind of, like the WPATH files were a revelation in itself. And the ability for people to reject what's right in front of them and to say, no, you're missing the point. Trans is the answer to all these children's problems. And then, like you say, on the granular level, within families all over the world, there's the very same thing. Whether it's the trans-identified kid convincing the parent or the parent reconvincing the child, I do think people often who are commentators on this, they talk about the parents, I think in quite a derogatory way, presuming that the parents immediately jump on the bus and immediately sail into it. There might be a small number of that. I think it's much more common that the parents are horrified, very worried, not into it, very questioning, very, very, usually the last to kind of get on board with the whole thing. The school very often are much faster to jump on it, friends and peers and stuff. And then when the parents do, they're all in. They're in almost for life. There's no going back, really, when you've started to medicate your child for an identity. And that medication leads to very significant challenges.
Yeah.
You've convinced yourself, you've crossed the Rubicon. You've convinced yourself of something that you can't really cognitively accept that you shouldn't have done.
Yeah. When we were preparing for this episode, you said, we have to talk about Leon Festinger. And I knew that he had originated the term cognitive dissonance, but I didn't know a lot about the original kind of research or study that, made him so famous. And I want to talk about this a little bit. So he got interested in a lot of the doomsday. So he was a psychologist, right? Yeah. And he got interested in doomsday cults because, of course, well, they don't think they're cults, right? But let's say like these religious groups with prophecies. They say nobody thinks they're joining a cult. We don't know how many doomsdayers might be listening here, Stella. No, I'm just kidding. Our audience is quite well informed.
I remember. Anyway. Can I just jump in? Do you remember when the WPATH files were released? And WPATH released a very strange statement saying, "The Earth is not flat, and gender is diverse." They were trying to kind of equate people who bought into the idea that the WPATH files had revealed an extraordinary revelation around WPATH.
We're like flat earthers.
We're suddenly flat earthers. So it was a very clever piece of marketing. But anyway, back to Leon.
It's remarkable. And we'll talk about flat earth a little bit later. But so he got interested in the doomsday cult. And there was one particular doomsday cult that had made a prediction very kind of soon in the future, like a couple of months in the future, that the earth was going to end, something like that. Yeah. So he decided to research them. Yeah. And particularly in the wake of the day that they had, prophesized would be the last day on Earth. Of course, the Earth continued to happen. And so he got really curious about how do they make sense of this? How do they square the reality of the planet still being here with their very apocalyptic beliefs?
Yeah. And what they did is they infiltrated the UFO believers. And they did a study, and they were in a house a few miles away from the house that was waiting for the UFO. And Dorothy Martin was the name of the leader of the UFO believers, and they genuinely thought a spaceship was going to land in their garden and bring them off to another planet. And she practiced something called automatic writing, which, you could argue, sometimes these kind of grandiose therapists who believe that they can see the truth within somebody. This automatic writing, it's like kind of, I can see the truth. I can just, you know what I mean? So she was consumed by her power that she could do this automatic writing. Automatic writing is apparently sending you messages from, the UFO, the Seekers was the name of the group. And so Festinger and his colleagues had infiltrated the UFO believers, and they watched them and they analysed them that night as they were waiting for the UFO to land. It was due to land at 12 midnight. And they were all ready, and they'd taken off their bras and taken out all wires and watches, all ready for I know, because the UFO wouldn't be happy with wires and things like that. So they were already in the house. Okay. And the psychologists had infiltrated the actual group to watch what was going to happen when the UFO didn't land. And so at 12 midnight, it was due to land, and nothing happened. And there was a quietness, a kind of tension, and kind of slight funny jokes. And then at 12:05, somebody found another clock in the house that was actually saying it was 5 to 12. So, it's all right. It's okay. We're 5 minutes late. It's coming in 5 minutes. So then they went back into their kind of vigil. Then, of course, it didn't come. And there was a kind of a stricken silence. There was a few attempts at laughs. There was a kind of a horrified couple of hours, really until about 4 o'clock that morning. And then the very interesting compensation started creeping. And Dorothy Martin, the leader of the group of the Seekers, started to do automatic writing. And it turned out that they're praying all night, they're coming together, their energy that night of coming together in the little house had saved planet Earth. And so they didn't need to be brought away by the UFO in the garden. They actually had managed to save planet Earth. And so actually they had become the saviors. It was the most amazing thing in the world. And so this is a group that had shunned publicity until that day. The next day they went out, they phoned the media, they sang Christmas carols because it was just coming up to Christmas. They were much more into it as a result. They did a flip in their mind because they just could not accept the fact that they might have got it wrong, that there wasn't a UFO coming to save them. And so instead they thought, we enacted something extraordinary and we have saved the world with it. Now that might sound kind of convoluted, but this was the first true real life analysis of what happens to these people who believe something extraordinary, it doesn't happen, and then they get deeper into it and deeper and deeper and deeper. Happens in cults all the time. The thing doesn't happen and they double down. And it's called When Prophecy Fails, the book. I kind of discussed it. I really studied it in my book Fragile. That's where I first got into it years ago. And it's just such an extraordinary story. And if you want to know about why do people double down, is basically mentally you cannot face the idea that what you believed in has been absolutely wrong. It's so difficult to contemplate for your psyche that your psyche will just grab anything to convince yourself something else is going on. And actually, the something else that's going on is going to make you feel, oh, thank God, I got it right. Yeah. And that's what's going to happen.
It makes me curious because we've interviewed a few whistleblowers, Eitan Heim, Jamie Reed, Tamara Pitsky, and there are people who at some point are willing to change their mind. So it makes me curious about what are the kind of characteristics or qualities that make it more or less likely that a person can overcome the cognitive dissonance and like reintegrate the new information into their worldview. And, you know, in the Leon Festinger research, they identified a couple of conditions that make beliefs resistant to change. One of them is that the belief is held with such a deep conviction that it has to have, relevance to your actions and what you do. So it's like if you are part of a group that schedules or organizes their life around certain principles and certain beliefs that actually impacts your day-to-day experience and how you operate, it makes it harder to resist. So if we think about gender identity, I mean, you have had to completely flip your world and your child's world upside down
Oh my
You have
God.
closed certain doors on their health and well-being. You've announced to the whole world that this is a trans child, and you become deeply invested because of all the actions you've had to take. There has to be kind of a great deal of commitment. So, like, the more important those actions are, the harder it is to break that belief. So, it's like we were talking earlier about how in medicine, sometimes we are mistaken about an intervention, let's say, ADHD
Yeah.
meds or antidepressants at
Yeah.
some point were touted as these miracle drugs. And then, of course,
Yeah.
over time, we realize it's a bit more complicated than that. The diagnostic categories themselves are very vague, but the trade-off that you make when you put your child on ADHD medicine, it's not nothing, right? It isn't negligible, but it's nothing compared to changing their body permanently with these drugs and impacting their health, destroying sexual function. I mean, it's just the magnitude of importance of what you've done is so intense. The belief must be sufficiently specific and sufficiently concerned with the real world so that events may unequivocally refute the belief. So,
Yeah, it's almost made for the situation we're in right now. And Helen Joyce said it very famously that the parents will be the last to pull out. And so many people quote that point, and it's such a good point. Everything suggests that the parents will not pull out, that the parents
yeah,
will actually go to their grave. Remember we did that episode about the lobotomy. You know what I mean? And that the doctor who went around the country when he was dying of cancer to
yeah,
prove to himself that that he had done the right thing. But the parents are deeper in. They're much
yeah,
deeper in. And it's something I think that is particularly difficult as far I've kind of examined, the parents' role as well as the actual people who transition. And also, I have a detransition support group for Beyond Trans, and the reflection and the melancholy, but also the depth that the detransitioners bring to their experience. That is really quite heartening, if you follow me, because you can almost accept, or you certainly can bear a mistake you made, but a mistake you made upon your child is arguably unbearable. And that's what this letter at the top of the podcast, what you read out, this piece of writing, was the parents can't bear it. The parents are saying, you can't have this wrong. And I know quite a few detransitioners, too many, that haven't told their family that they've detransitioned. You know what I mean? Because they just think, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. And I don't want
what
to
is the it that they
impose it on them.
suspect they'll hear? Oh, that the parents don't want to hear it.
The parents don't want to hear it. And I don't want to break their hearts. So I'm just quietly detransition. So they're living stealth detransition. I know.
Oh, man.
I know. And I used to think this was an anomaly. And then I was meeting it again and again. And I was like, what is this? This is a whole new complexity. So they go off the hormones, and effectively, does anybody know when you go off the hormones? Because when you've been a few years on it, you're kind of done facially or whatever, so it's an extraordinary scenario. But I do think that we are along. There was a moment before the podcast, Sasha, that you went, oh, can it ever end? Because actually the way this is going, and I think ending, it reminds me, sorry I'm garbled here, but it reminds me of, I've read a lot around wars and history, and the concept was always, it'll be over by Christmas, by Christmas. Every single year the war will be over by Christmas. And it's like we are like that. It'll be over, the cast review, the WFAT files, it'll be over soon. I think we are in danger of almost doing our own doubling down, that it will be over. Maybe it won't, I hate to say this, maybe it won't be over, maybe it will shift in conceptual understanding.
Yeah.
Maybe rather than this idea that it'll be over. Now, I know people will disagree, and I'm very interested in the comments that will tell us why we've got it wrong, because who knows? None of us can predict the future. But arguably there might be a shift in our understanding of what transition is and a kind of a growing understanding of there are other options to medical transition, as opposed to ding, ding, it's over.
Yeah, and I mean, something that I've been thinking about too, you mentioned earlier, the gender doctors who say that they can predict who the quote, trans kids are versus not. And I'm thinking a little bit about the way other medical scandals have fallen
Oh,
into
yeah.
more of like a pseudoscience quackery category. And I suspect that that might be part of what happens. You know, now,
Yeah.
again, the stakes are so high with gender medicine that is so unlike other, like, let's say, pseudoscientific
Yeah.
interventions that,
Recover. Yeah.
doctors are claiming to heal you of this and heal you of that. I mean, the stakes are really high, but I think those examples are instructive, right? So we think about, what happened with multiple personality disorders. This was a kind of theory about the way that we can fragment into multiple parts, and this was kind of layered on top of repressed trauma and all of these things that had a scientific sounding element to them, but in fact they were not. They were pseudoscience. They were just total theories, and that fell by the wayside. And I think what we still see is there are indeed people every now and then. I put out a video recently about the repressed memories epidemic, and some people went under there and commented that no, actually, this really does happen. And I'm
Yeah.
so surprised that you dismissed the findings of so-and-so doctor or therapist. So there will always be true believers when you
Yeah.
have an esoteric theory that is kind of like hard to disprove. And, I think a lot about what's happening with the Cass report, and it's really hard to like, on one hand, Cass is trying to say there's no evidence that these medical interventions are helpful. But at the core of this, we're talking about a theory
Yeah.
about a person being trans or having a gender identity. And I read an amazing piece recently by Unyielding Bicyclist, who's coming on our show in a couple of weeks. And she kind of talks about how evidence-based medicine is like we're barking up the wrong tree, because
You're
we're
right.
taking seriously the idea of a gender identity,
Yes.
and then we need
Yeah.
research. And you always say we could, there's enough research. We don't need any more research. We need to just kind of move into the next stage of clarity around this.
You're so right. There's a concept that has happened, which is medicalizing identities, and to seek research to prop up that. Can we get research that vinegar cures cancer? No, there's no evidence to support it, but it might. You could go to your death saying, but it
Totally.
might. If you follow me,
Yes.
having to
Yes.
disprove it, it's like Bertrand Russell's kind of concept of there could be a China teapot circling around planet Earth, and it's our job. The onus isn't on us to prove that there isn't a China teapot circling the Earth. The onus isn't on us to say that we should medicalize identities. You know what I mean? That isn't it. It's a concept. I don't know if I'm making sense here. It's
Yes,
a concept that we are choosing to medicalize identities. We've never medicalized identities before. And this is something that is conceptually such a massive consequence on the body that the onus should be on the other end of the field. They should be proving that this makes sense rather than we should be disproving that this makes sense. We've completely got the wrong end of the stick, and we've allowed that, like in a lot of ways, because in a way I think there was an awful lot of strategy before any of us were even thinking about it. They've kind of 10 years on us. I shouldn't say they, but the people who are very pro-medicalization have kind of, in a way, really, really conceptually stole a march on us. And so they're way ahead of us. And it really feels like we are trailing, trying to kind of show research of something that it doesn't make sense that we're looking for this research. And if we're not careful, we're going to double down into research and become doubler downers, become like the UFO seekers,
Yes.
Research will set us free.
Yes, and this is so complicated because at the end of the day, we cannot bifurcate the world into people who believe in this and people who don't. I just
Right.
don't know. I mean, I thought we were going to go into this episode just like very kind of articulate, explaining the science of doubling down and the psychology of doubling down. But at the end of the day, what do we actually do here? I don't have a great answer for that, because there are people who, as we've laid out the kind of beginning of this episode, have so much incentive to
Yeah.
disbelieve any of the skepticism, any of the research, any of the systematic reviews. And they have made this decision, whether as adults or whether parents and their children, they have made a decision after being convinced tirelessly by activists claiming suicide threats and all of these kind of manipulative tactics. They've made a decision to go down this road. And so they are in a real psychological bind.
Yeah.
And, we obviously could talk to our listeners who have a ton of skepticism about childhood transition, and we do. But what are we going to do with all of these people who I think in a lot of cases, they did the best they could with the information they had. Sure, I'm sure there are some people who are really nefarious, Munchausen's type parents, but I actually don't think that's the majority of parents. So we are in a real pickle here. And I do think it's up to the institutions not to be cowards about this. I mean, we recently saw this remarkable thing. The Philadelphia Psychological Association, Pennsylvania Psychological Association, in their listserv. Now, this is a group of professionals who are mental health professionals in the state of Pennsylvania. They were talking about the Cass report. And they put out a statement basically saying, we forbid anyone in this listserv to mention or talk about the Cass report. And I quote, because their LGBTQ members felt targeted, harmed, and hurt. Wow. So what are we going to do when the institutions themselves, I mean, I know that this is not like a governing body, right? It's a professional association of members. So it's not like they make laws, but that sends a clear message to people who are supposed to be objective and follow the evidence and follow the developments in the field, that even you professionals are not allowed to talk about this. So no wonder people are doubling and tripling down. I just feel like this is a real crisis, and I don't know how we get out of it.
Well, I think it will be very slowly. I think it and it won't be it'll be over by Christmas. It won't be an over. It'll be less and less people will believe that this is a healthy option. I do think that fundamentally there has been a co-opting, a conflation of being gay is, being trans is like being gay. Every piece of evidence you're going to give me, they're thinking, is just frankly transphobic.
Yeah.
And so you can give me all the evidence. You have to just put yourself into the mindset of somebody,
Yes.
You're in 1990, somebody's giving you evidence that somebody gay is disordered, and you're just thinking, you're homophobic, get out of my face. I don't really want to see. Stop waving research at me, because it's just making me think you're batty, you're bigoted and you're batty. Yes. And so that's all people are thinking. So us thinking that we can kind of research our way out of it isn't, I think we have to win the hearts and minds. And how we win the hearts and minds is tackling that fundamental belief that being gay and being trans is actually the very similar. They say, oh yeah, it's different, but it's similar. You know what I mean? But I'm like, no. It's not at all similar. It's not similar on any level. Obviously there's, overlapping experiences, but these are not similar scenarios. And if we could go for that rather than anything else, I think we'd get a lot further, a lot sooner. But I think there will always be people. There's a very well-known activist lawyer in the UK, for example, and it's going to be his life's mission. It's quite clear. He's going to be, I think, on Twitter for life. I think he's going to be taking cases for life. I don't think there'll be a slap of the forehead and a realization that he's got it
Well,
wrong.
because can you explain, though, he medicalized his child, right? Like, he has a trans-identified child. Like, this is, I think, just one example. There are lots of people with trans-identified children who have made it their life's mission to slap away any kind of disconfirming evidence around this. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Is that accurate?
Yeah. So that's very accurate. And, he's made it his life's mission. He's got to go to, he uses the law to kind of confirm that he's doing it right. And there was a very sad tweet he released there a couple of weeks ago where he talked about the suicide. It was grotesque because it was weaponizing suicide. It was based upon misinformation. It wasn't appropriate. However, I did see real anguish in his post, because he was talking about how all these kids are going to die by suicide, because he believed it and because he has to believe it, because the alternative is so horrifying. He cannot believe it. He doesn't accept it. He's not hearing it. He never will. And so he thinks these transphobic people are ruining everything. And the anguish of my kid is a direct reflection of society's transphobia. Not the anguish of my kid is a very distressing thing to contemplate. And maybe we should approach this in a different way. You can see it obviously writ large with Susie Green, who was the CEO of Mermaids, and she in a bid to kind of save her child, her child identified as trans, and she gave TED Talks about it, and she talked about how they went over to Thailand, and this was when it wasn't, it was Thailand have since will not give surgery to a boy on his 16th birthday for genital surgery, but that's what happened for this child. And the kid, is obviously in their 20s and remains trans-identified as far as I know. The point being, when you've gone that far, you're not going to come back, so forget about it. They're not going to come back. So now we have to think, the world has shifted in this way. There's going to be a whole cohort who are not coming back. They're doubled down. Yeah. And now we have to think, how do we live within this so that we can on some level come out of the war that we seem to be in, and there can be some sort of kind of peace process almost. This is such a fascinating conversation. Listeners often tell us they feel frustrated by the lack of nuance around this issue, and they feel afraid to speak their minds.
And they ask us how they can help to bring more clarity to this difficult topic at their workplace, in their kids' schools, or with their own friends and family. Well, here are 3 things you can do right now.
1. Follow. Wherever you're listening to this, take a second to click like, follow, or subscribe.
2. Share. Send this podcast to anyone who you think might appreciate it.
3. Join. Support our efforts by becoming a paid Substack supporter. Go to widerlenspod.com now to subscribe.
Now back to the discussion. Yeah, this kind of makes me think about, I did a couple of years ago, I did some videos about critical thinking and the backfire effect. And of course, there's a lot of overlapping elements here. And, there are a couple of ways that we can encourage people to change their minds about things and to have a perspective shift. And maybe we can talk about some of those elements, right? Because one of the important things is trust and credibility of the source of information, right? So for example, if you have somebody who, let's say, personally knew Hillary Cass herself and had worked with her for many, many years and felt very strongly that she was a person of integrity and that she was going to try to really find the truth here, that person is highly likely to take the recommendations of the Cass report and incorporate them into their understanding. Now, people who are real activists have this whole narrative built up around cis privilege and, nothing about us without us, and this idea that if you are not part of this inner group, that you cannot possibly be a trusted source on such important matters. So that polarization and that us versus them mentality puts us in a really difficult spot for this type of thing. And that's why I think, you and I, especially you and Genspect, we've encountered various, let's say, fragmentations in various, organizations or groups or people, or I think this and you think this. And I think it's very important not to splinter off and become
Yeah.
very antagonistic with people, because then you've diminished the trust that allows us to actually make progress. So, this is just something that I thought a
That's a
lot
really good
about. And
point.
I know you work with parents and you, I'm sure, talk about this. The relationship that a parent has with their child is the only leverage they have to help them. So if your
Yeah.
child thinks you are a transphobic bigot, not your fault, right? Because of some of the ideology, and you don't have a close relationship and you're not spending positive quality time together, it doesn't matter what amazing scientific studies you have. The trust has to be there for that
Yeah.
to kind of sink in. So do you have any thoughts about just trust before we kind of shift gears into some other
Oh, it's such a
dynamics?
beautiful point you made. While I was driving us into doom and gloom, you said that there is, of course there is, and you're so right. There is always ways through, even though they're very hard. And time and again, the relationship brings people a long way. It is, we did have I don't know whether it'll be out before us, but there is a lovely interview that we had with Tali where she could have doubled down, but she was faced with kind of incontrovertible evidence that what she believed the other group weren't well informed on. And once she realized, well, they're not informed on this, they might be informed on other things. So there is an argument that a certain level of knowledge, that if people can start to learn, if we can somehow get the information into the mainstream, any little piece. For example, if we did nothing else but the entire movement of everybody who's worried about medical transition for children and young people, vulnerable people, if everybody grouped together and just spent the next 24 months focusing on the suicide myth and nothing else, and if we managed to kind of realize that myth has been badly kind of weaponized and misused and misappropriated. And of course, there is an issue with people who have mental health issues and suicide, but there always will be. And that is the sum of the risk in many ways. If we could just kind of get little nuggets of kind of the evidence-based information out, arguably, slowly but surely, a more well-informed public. You're smiling. Do you think I'm kidding myself?
No, because incremental exposure is another one of
Okay.
those things that allows people to change their mind when the possibility of doubling down exists. So we talk a lot. I've heard you say pebbles in a barrel. I call it
Yeah.
planting seeds of doubt. I've heard people say breadcrumbs of reality. And so you're right. Like if the public could slowly but surely piecemeal kind of discover different little elements about the whole narrative that begins to put doubts or questions in their mind, that incremental exposure is a very important part of that process. And
Yeah.
social dynamics matter. So if you are a person who's deeply integrated in a group of very zealous activists, like Tali was, for example, it's very hard to change your mind. But if you
Yeah.
are, exposed to lots of different perspectives and you are engaging with different ideas and different types of people, and you do not live in an echo chamber, which many of us do because so many of us live online, that also makes it easier to change your mind, is like having a variety of inputs.
Yeah, but I'm kind of like Dolores of the Sorrows here, because I can't help think of the left and right divide. And
Yeah.
I certainly was very, very left all my life. And then I became, as everybody is these days, politically homeless and looking on. And there feels like there's almost an institutional doubling down between the left and the right. It's become increasingly polarized. So the idea that this will be over by Christmas has become just laughable. It's just, what I mean? No way, because there's an actual entire left-right divide now. So it's seeped into a much bigger concept. And it feels like it could go on for many years, really,
Yeah.
with doubling down and doubling down. And arguably, maybe somewhere, if you look at north of Ireland, if you look at Africa, if you look at anywhere which went through, like in Northern Ireland it was 40 years, but like a kind of a serious doubling down, and then a realization that there's been too much pain. There's been too much pain. There's too much division. There's too much fight. You have to get, it's almost like, when somebody is alcoholic and they realize there's too much pain, I have to try something else. And arguably we're kind of far from that, because it's still kind of discourse. Like I said, I'm like Dolores of the Sorrows. I was reluctant to make the point, but it felt like the truth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another thing that came up when I was doing this research was just the power of narratives. And, I think one of the things I've seen as a therapist is that when we have a strongly held belief, we are very good at finding holes in other narratives that might otherwise resonate with us, right? So, for example, a dysphoric kid might, especially if they're kind of particularly rigid, hear a desistance story or a detransition story and find the one or two elements that are nothing like them. And that's why this is not going to resonate with me. But I do think, when we interviewed Jesper, he said something very interesting. He said, you're not going to win over the people who are part of the gender church. What you can do is have an influence over people who are on the fence, people who are kind of normie bystanders, so to speak. So I think, there will always be people doubling down who are already in the fringes of this belief system. But I think actually, I've seen some polling. Most Americans do not agree that puberty blockers or transition for children is appropriate. And these are normie people. So I think perhaps what we can say, while some people and some groups are doubling down, the true believers, there are probably lots of more neutral parties who are watching all of this go down, if they even get wind that it's happening. And then they may be, more inclined to question things. For example, I think I should mention this. We talked to Joshua Coleman recently.
Oh, yeah.
And Joshua Coleman is an estrangement expert. And of course, in the mid-2010s, like many of us, he started to see gender identity as what he calls a flashpoint to estrangement in his work. And he wrote a book called The Rules of Estrangement, and several parents, or let me not say parents, I don't know if they're parents, but several people in our Substack, our podcast Substack, wrote saying, I want to, agree with Joshua Coleman here, but his book really did not understand parents' plight around gender identity, and he was really suggesting parents to be totally affirming. And I found it very off-putting, et cetera, et cetera. And I recently did a video with Joshua for my private membership group. And one of the things I asked him about is, has his perspective on gender changed? And he said, oh, absolutely. I am much more, skeptical of the gender affirmation model now. When I wrote my book, the messaging in all of, psychology was just, you have to be affirming. That's the right thing to do. But now that I've read the Cass report and the WPATH files, because he is keeping up with all the research, he's had a total change of heart. So I think that that's a good example of how reasonable, quote, normie people who are not deep down the rabbit hole of gender can be, I don't want to say persuaded, but can look at the unfolding evidence and say, wait a minute, we got this wrong. So maybe not everyone's doubling down is perhaps like a bright way to look at this.
You're right. Everything that, of my reading would suggest you're right. The middle ground, the normies who aren't invested, they are very open to start thinking in another way. There's no doubt about that. The extremists are the people who've medicalized their children, that they're frankly going to be, like the Japanese fighters in the woods after the war. You know what I mean? They're there. They're in it. But there's vast swathes of people, way more people who aren't invested, who aren't very interested. I'm not going to say who it was, but I was only today speaking to a well-known author who didn't know anything about gender, but was asking me very intelligent questions. I was like, oh, that's so interesting. And I could see her brain was like, oh, Oh, I didn't
Mm-hmm.
think of that. And it's just
Mm-hmm.
because she wasn't interested, wasn't invested, hadn't really come across it in a big way, but was wide open for
Yeah.
conversation about it. That I don't think would have happened years ago because people would have just thought. I remember one therapist saying to me, "This is just too weird for me. It's just
Yeah.
this is too. I
Yeah.
can't talk about this. This is way off." But nowadays, it's become so normalized. It's not too weird. It's kind of like, what is going on? Because that was the
Yeah.
the writers thought was, well, what is that all about? And the second thing that I think could give us a lot of heart is the concept of social contagion. And if you kind of realize that, once a word gets into the lexicon, the likelihood of more people identifying with that concept or experience is higher. The word desistance is going into the lexicon. The word detransition is definitely in the lexicon. I remember I was doing my master's and I said to the professor something about detransition. I wanted to study detransition. And he literally stopped everything. He said, detransition? What is that? Like, it
Mm-hmm.
was like, what? Never heard of it in my
Mm-hmm.
life. I don't think that would happen today. I think people would
Yeah.
kind of quite rapidly come to, oh, that's those regretters. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that will have its own contagion. Trans people will hear about detransition and inevitably they will start to identify towards that. That's very sad, but it's also very likely. And desistance also needs to come in a little bit more. We need to talk about it more because that's going to lead to its own contagion. So it's not necessarily as doomy as I was kind of suggesting a few minutes
Yeah.
ago.
I'm curious too about the professionals, like I wonder if the whistleblower mentality it's obviously slightly different from professionals who have maybe gone along with this gender affirming care and now in light of the evidence have a change of heart or feel differently about it. I suspect those are probably not people who, for example, are activists and work in a gender clinic that is dedicated to this. These might have been therapists who just had a kid in their practice and maybe they referred them to the gender clinic thinking, I'm sure that's the appropriate place to send them. I wonder about that type of person. And I wonder, I mean, this isn't exactly about doubling down, but I wonder about real charlatans. I
Oh, yeah.
suspect there are some gender clinicians who actually just see a huge money making opportunity. I mean, I think there are
Uh-huh.
clearly the people who believe, like you said, this is a civil rights issue. We're fighting transphobia, like, supporting
Yeah.
gay people, et cetera. But there are probably others who just see dollar signs here. And
The
they can't
carpetbaggers.
ever really, they can't, yeah, carpetbaggers. They can't admit defeat either. I mean, is that fair to say? Because I was thinking about what you
Oh, yeah,
mentioned
this is a
earlier
good point.
about the people who say like, I can tell you who's really trans or not, and I'm sure some people really think they can, but there are probably people just totally pulling your leg who just got in on this huge booming industry. And is there, I mean, they're probably sociopaths to some degree, but what do you think of that group?
I tell you what, I think we have plenty to work with on that one because all around the world there's an extraordinary number of people who are working tirelessly with an extraordinary amount of energy, be they parents or clinicians or academics who are seeking to bring about more informed consent, for example. They're also seeking to bring in better policies. And when these charlatans realize actually, you are liable if you medically transition somebody and they don't have informed consent, you are liable for what happens. Policies can change that. They will move on to the next grift. They will move on to an easier way to make money. So
Mm-hmm.
the people who are
Mm-hmm.
making money now, it's very easy to make money, frankly, now. But when there are better policies in place, and they inevitably will be in place because people are working so hard on that
Mm-hmm.
level,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it won't be such an easy money maker. It'll take a little bit of time, but people like insurance companies will say, oh my God, it's not such an easy insurance scenario because I have to insure other aspects. For example, there's a GenSpec policy that we are we're making strides in, which is if an insurance company gives insurance for medical transition, they also have to give
Yeah.
insurance for secondary complications and perhaps the long term impact and detransition. So if policies like that get in, then insurance companies will pull away. Then the whole money kind of exchanging hands is massively reduced, and they
Hmm.
will move on to another thing, to somewhere else where they can make money. So we do have a lot of hope with that. I do think it'll take time, but that will change. Policies will come in.
Yeah, I think you're right. I watched, in kind of preparation for this, there were a couple things on my mind. Of course, I read up on Leon Festinger. I watched the documentary about flat earthers.
Oh
It's
yeah.
really interesting. It's called Behind the Curve, I think, or Beyond the Curve, something like that. And there's this remarkable scene. I mean, first of all, these are individuals who, they fell down a rabbit hole on YouTube and the internet, but they tend to be pretty curious people. They're people who care about understanding the world. They have a little skepticism, maybe too much skepticism, right? Um, and they tend to be kind of outsiders, and that really binds them together as a group, right? Imagine the
Yeah.
camaraderie you feel if you're part of this ultra, ultra, ultra minority of people who really know what's going on in the world. Like, that's how conspiracy theories bind people together, because, of
Yeah.
course, to go back to that trust, right? But there's a remarkable scene towards the end of the movie where they have devised this experiment that they believe will prove the earth is flat by setting up kind of like these almost like plywood boards a certain number of feet away from each other, and then shining a light through them. And then if the light is visible, then it means the earth is not curved because the light's going straight across or whatever. And of course, it doesn't work. Spoiler alert. Sorry to all the
The
flat earthers
UFO
listening.
is not landing in the garden.
No, but they immediately go to all of these. Oh, I know why, because our device was broken, or there were all these shrubs in the way. And it's just like an exact kind of example of what's happening now, right? Like, oh,
Wow.
well, Cass used studies that wouldn't have been admissible in other places, or her, heteronormativity and obsession with this or that thing make her unable to blah, blah, blah. But another thing that I watched, which is so interesting, I'm curious if you've seen it or other people, there's a film called An Honest Liar about the
No.
great James Randi. He's a magician who, in his career, he used, the world of deception to try and expose other fakers who are like, faith healers or various kinds of like, psychics who were deceiving the public and taking their money. And so he made it his mission to expose all of these like hucksters, so to speak. And it
Wow.
was interesting because there was a line in the movie, I can't remember it exactly, but something like, the minute that a magician claims not to be a magician and claims that he's actually doing these miracles is stealing money and lying to people. And so they were making the distinction between like a magician who is willingly telling you as an audience member, I'm going to use illusion and I'm going to trick you and I'm going to fool you and we'll all be amazed together. But then the second you veer into pretending like that's real, you are a fraudster. And when it comes to this idea of gender identity, I have to say, I thought a lot about these therapists who tell people, oh, yeah, you're the most trans person I've ever seen. I can guarantee that you're trans and that transition will be good for you. And we've heard that before. Going in with like no humility, right? And telling people, oh, yeah, I have the magic sauce. I can differentiate between a real trans person and a fake trans person. That's a fraud. That's a scam.
Yeah. I wrote a Substack about, have you watched Tell Them You Love Me on Netflix?
No, I want to
Oh,
watch it. I've heard
it's
about it.
it's harrowing. I sat down with
Okay.
my husband Henry, and afterwards he looked he looked like he needed to be hospitalised. Another lovely night with Stell. It's but it's worth watching because it gives real insight into the I think into the mindset of the gender affirmative
What is it
therapist.
about?
It's about facilitated communication, and it's a true
Okay.
story about a woman who who was a great believer in facilitated communicator and also had this extraordinary urge to save people. She was brought up by a mother who also was very involved in saving the downtrodden, the oppressed. Very noble urge, but very high and big in her. And she was very successful. She was a professor of philosophy. She was really successful. She became a facilitated communicator for a man who couldn't stand upright and who couldn't speak and who assessments suggested had the mental ability of an infant child. You know what I mean? He was really, really, really disabled. And she said that she could communicate on his behalf. So she basically would teach him how to use a computer that was made, a device that would, first of all, teach him how to spell cat and then bat and then brush and then ultimately her facilitated communication. Now, don't forget, her hand is moving his hand to make these words.
Yeah.
Ultimately, he was doing college courses through her hand. Okay. And then she said, spoiler alert, massive spoiler alert. Then she said they fell in love. He started writing that he loved her.
Wow.
And and then she told the family that they'd had sexual relations. And the family said no.
Oh my God.
Very like the gender affirmative. I can see you. I can help you. I can save you. I know your truth. I know your true self. Even if you're a very young child, I know this person's, I can save them. I can lead them to the better path, the better life. She honestly thought this guy had fallen in love with her. And this guy was really, really disabled and wasn't really cognitively able. She left her family. She left her husband until she truly believed it. She ended up, there was a court case. She goes to jail. The Netflix documentary, I know, follow her after she's left jail.
Wow.
This has all happened in the last 10, 15 years. And she still believes it. She still believes that they fell in love. Yeah. It's a devastating story, but it's very much, well, there's doubling down. You leave your family, you go to jail, and you still believe that you had unleashed an intelligence in this person by your facilitated communication, which is basically your hand on their hand tapping out words. And they couldn't, once another facilitated communicator came in, they couldn't replicate
it. Yeah.
Very similar, reminds me of the Dutch protocol. They never were able to replicate the results of the Dutch model. For those of you who don't know, this was the beginning of puberty blockers. So it's unbelievable. Humans kind of desire to kind of create a narrative, which of course we might be guilty of right now. Of course we are.
Fair.
You know what I mean? Yeah, we don't know what we are convincing ourselves right now. I know I convince myself about my weight every day, that I'm losing weight all the time. In every way.
That's an easy one to verify, Stella. There are scales.
Oh, I don't believe in scales fully enough. So they're very bad for you.
They're all wrong. They're all miscalibrated.
I can't think. But yeah, our ability to kid ourselves, it goes all the way, doesn't it? It goes all the way. And honestly, the mind has mountains, as Jared Manley Hopkins said. We have to create a narrative that makes us life and reality bearable.
Yeah.
We have to do what we need to do to get through. And we do it all the time in this maddening, cruel world. We do it all the time. We create narratives that but we choose our poison.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, this is what's so, I think, and again, of course, this is going to be just a validation of my own perspective here, but when we become totally disconnected from embodied reality, that particular trait of humanness can put us in a very dangerous place. Yes, we all create narratives to make sense of our particular circumstances. But what's happening in actual three-dimensional biological reality really matters. And, this whole thing with the Cass report and the doubling down just makes you think, well, there are an infinite number of ways to justify medical complications, revision surgeries, painful outcomes. And, I just think we have to be so cognizant of whether the stories we tell ourselves are kind of like spinning us further and further away from the three-dimensional reality, or are they helping us be present with our kind of real truth, capital T.
And I'd like to move into the kind of bonus content where we discuss, because I know a lot of detransitioners or transitioned people who then become detransitioners listen to this. And I know a lot of clinicians who are affirmative listen to this because they write to us after. I know a lot of parents who are very concerned about where they are. So I'd love us to discuss like the self-forgiveness that you need to have, but also the flexibility you need to have to contemplate the fact that maybe you've gone down a road, and it mightn't be anything to do with gender, but maybe you've gone down a road that you should perhaps open your mind and just check, is this checkable? Because if it's not checkable, arguably you've doubled down.
That's amazing, because cognitive flexibility and psychological openness was another one of those protective factors against backfire effect and doubling down. So we'll talk about that in the bonus episode. But for our general listeners, we'll say thank you for listening. It was nice to think this through out loud because there's a lot here.
Yeah, I love my episodes with you, Sasha.
Me too, Stella. Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.